Dalia, you recently published a book, Arab Spring, Modernity, Identity, and Change. What are the main findings of your research? And almost, I guess, close to 10 years after the Arab Spring, what do you think is the actual legacy of the movement?
So this is actually my third book on post-Arab Spring states.
Okay.
And the question is, what did we miss, but how have we been studying the Middle East incorrectly? So the book was looking for new metaphors for studying this region that we've been treating separately. For example, questions like, statements like the Arab Street. What is the Arab Street? We've taken this for granted so long in literature as if the Arab Street is one monolith. And so the book aimed to break the paradigms, break the language, break the vernacular through which we've been studying the Middle East. And so the primary findings is that had we possibly been looking for different variables, we might have been able to see different trends. 10 years after the Arab Spring, what do we see? We all remember that critical moment of hope, change, people asking for democracy, good governance, transparency. What we have today, save Tunisia, is a much more repressive region in the Middle East. For example, a country like Egypt, people came to the square asking for bread, opportunity, good governance, transparency, basically political pluralism. And what you have in a situation like Egypt today is extreme repression. You have a president who's emerged as a supreme executive. You have a judiciary that basically does as the president wants, and a parliament that is a rubber stamp to the regime. But more critically than that, politically, there are no political parties. Much of the opposition is in prison. Egypt has 60,000 political prisoners. Economically, internal debt since 2013 has tripled. External loans have tripled. The government has created a situation where austerity measures have made the average lived experience of the Egyptians so difficult that it's worse than pre-revolution moments. And so Egypt's coming at an interesting moment where 10 years after the Arab Spring, it's not just worse off, the kind of forces that led to that spring are also in prison today. And so the question is, when things get worse, what happens?
So what happens?
People come to the squares in a different moment. So we all have seen the videos of Muhammad Ali, this kind of internal military contractor, knows the internal politics of what the moment, and come out and say, I'm going to reveal to you what really happens. Now, technically, we all know corruption happens in Egypt, but here the president had been pushing the country towards extreme austerity measures, even telling citizens in Egypt, maybe education is not for all, maybe we have to sacrifice, maybe we have to suffer. And then he reveals, Muhammad Ali, that the president actually is spending lavishly on himself and his family. And it's that kind of calling for austerity, but then having extreme theft from within the state that might have led people to come out into squares a couple of months ago. But again, in a disorganized way, can these revolutionary moments sustain to real change? And the unfortunate consequence is a return to extreme repression. Now, repression can only take you so far. You can't actually hold a country together through fear.
So in these recent protests in Egypt, for you, do they compare to the famous January 25th juncture or not?
So on January 25th, you saw this kind of magical opening where people had broken through the fear barrier. The fear barrier was a lot lower than it was this past fall. People coming into squares had to really sacrifice themselves. And we saw the result of that, where it was not just mass arrests, but mass torture. Amnesty International released a report on, for example, women's prisons, calling them cycles of hell. Because if a young man decides to go out and protest, the regime today is not just going to punish him, they'll punish his mother and his sister. So here in this critical moment of this past, there was a presidential referendum on the Constitution to amend it to extend term limits. And there was supposed to be an internal vote. And it occurred, and of course it was rigged. So what you saw happen externally was a kind of shadow poll to actually ask Egyptians what they believed. And it was called Batil, or the Void Movement. And so Egyptians actually went online to hypothetically vote against this constitutional referendum. And it got millions of votes. And so while people accuse Egyptians today of being apathetic, that there's nothing they can do, we're starting to see these kind of signals that no, change might be coming on the horizon.
Recent data from the Arab Barometer, a pollster that surveys Arab countries, seem to show that Arabs are losing face in religious parties and leaders. What do you make of this data? And if you agree with it, do you think this will be a long-term trend or not?
The findings tell us that people had been tying religion to politics because of the rise of political Islam. And so when you tie religion to politics and see the failure of politics, you actually begin to associate organized religion with organized politics. And so the greater trend is actually more troubling. It's not just that there is a lack of trust in political Islam, it's that it's extending to a lack of trust in Islam itself as having a solution. And so one of the current projects I'm working on now is the rise and fall of the Muslim Brotherhood and the future of political Islam. And what I'm finding there is that if we don't decouple religion from having political solutions to religion having a social cultural impact, as many of these movements started to in the beginning, then what you're ultimately doing is telling the average citizen that failure of political Islam is ultimately failure of Islam. And that is what the current data is showing us.
Would you say that the anti-Muslim sentiment in the US is similar to the anti-Muslim sentiment in Europe?
So the Muslim populations in the United States and Europe are very different. Most of the immigrant Muslims that came to the United States came in the late 1960s with the change in the quota system on allowing immigration to the United States. And it was for a very select group. It was for professionals to come and build the medical and scientific institutions in the United States. So this was the great brain drain. So this population was able to come to the United States and directly enter the middle class. And so the US population of Arab and South Asian Muslims are people that have entered the middle class and become ultimately successful. What the Pew data tells us about Muslim Americans is that they are the most economically stable religious minority groups, that Muslim American women are the second most educated religious minority women after Jewish American women. That Muslim American children are not just economically stable, but actually feel that this country belongs to them. Now, this all changes, of course, in the era of Trump, but if you compare this to the Muslim communities of Europe, especially in a place like UK or France, that immigrant population did not come and enter the middle class. They actually entered the working class and the working poor. And so Muslims in Europe, by and large, in the immigrant population, live in slums or live in economic situations where they feel marginalized. And we all know that those that feel marginalized, feel excluded, feel that the country doesn't see them as members of the population, ultimately start to react against that.
Would you say that there's an effect of Islamophobia on U.S. foreign policy as well?
I think the way foreign policy is framed in terms of, for example, wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, where there's going to be a liberation of a certain population from evils, from lack of civilization, the idea that there is something inherently problematic with Islam gives justification for narratives of liberation that feed the war narrative. But also, we're starting to see it today, for example, in the conversations about what happens to the widows and the children of ISIS. You know, there's a panel here at the Doha Forum on ISIS recruitment of women and what happens to women and children. When we speak about this particular population, we don't talk about this population as being rehabilitationable, right? They can't be rehabilitated. But when we talk about child soldiers in Africa, they can be rehabilitated. That mass rape in Serbia by armies can be rehabilitated. We talk about young children who have endured some of the worst violence at the hands of ISIS. We've abandoned them because those populations can't be rehabilitated. So when we talk about the effects of Islamophobia, it's not just on the war narrative and the justification to go to war, but it's also about how you abandon certain populations as ungovernable, untenable, can't be rehabilitated.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'm going to stop here.
It's great to meet you.
Yeah. Enjoy the rest of the Doha Forum.
Thank you so much.